Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here at the Veritas Forum. I've been asked to speak on secularism and its relationship to tolerance, and I'm happy to do it because I suppose I am a secularist, though I mean something very specific by that, and I'll try and explain what that is. Can you hear me clearly? In some ways, I'm not the best person to speak on this subject if the organizers were looking for some rabid secularist like Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens and so on, whom I think are some of the most distasteful people on the intellectual scene today. So I hope people weren't expecting some polemical evening. Let me tell you a little bit first about why I think if one is a secularist, one shouldn't really focus on the sorts of things that people like Dawkins do. Religion today, it seems to me, is not primarily about doctrine or belief. Those debates were debates of the Victorian period, and they're tired and somewhat pointless debates today. Religion is a very big subject, it's a very important subject, but what's important and interesting about it is not doctrinal issues. If you stick a microphone in somebody's face and ask them, do you believe in creationism? They're not going to say no. I mean, if you say in the heart of Kansas or Nebraska, if you ask somebody in Tehran or Bradford in England, ask a Muslim in a poll whether he or she believes one should live by the Sharia, they're not going to say no. But if you look at their lives and their commitments in their everyday lives, creationism or the Sharia don't have a very major or basic role in the structure of their lives at all. So there's something idle about a lot of the debates about secularism versus religion today. Religion is a very deep thing in this country, as you know, especially in the heartland. But what it has to do is not really with beliefs of that kind, but the kinds of community and solidarity that it brings in the lives of people. And in this country, it's particularly important to understand that because the fact is that Western Europe has had the same history in some ways, intellectual history, as the heartland of this country, but Western Europe does not have anything like the same religiosity in the lives of people. And the reason for that, I believe, is that in Western Europe, there was a very long tradition of at least 100 years or more of social democracy, in which there were very powerful labor traditions, and those meant a lot in the everyday lives of people. Going to a union hall once or twice a week provided sources of community and solidarity. And such traditions and such movements and so on simply have not been a part of the heartland of this country. There have been some in the coast, especially the East Coast, but even where they existed, those have died out. And so that partly explains some of the yearning for community, which only the church provides. So I think those are the issues. And if Dawkins and people were prepared to study sociological issues underlying religious practice and commitment, that would be an interesting thing. But they have no interest in that. They only have an interest in bullying people to change their personal beliefs. and the announcements about doctrine. So what then is the issue about secularism, and what do I mean when I say that I'm a secularist? Well, that's easy to say. Here is what I mean by it. Now, it's obvious that secularism is something which is not necessarily tied to liberalism. There have been completely authoritarian, illiberal secularists like Ataturk in Turkey and Saddam Hussein's Ba'athist government in Iraq, and they've been perfectly secular. Saddam Hussein cynically appealed to religion from time to time, but it was essentially a secular government, and yet they were completely authoritarian. They were, both Ataturk and Saddam Hussein were, in their way, thugs, in their different ways. So the form of secularism that I more or less avow is secular liberalism, and by that I mean this, and it's quite possible that Vinoth and I don't disagree on these subjects. So let me tell you what it is that I think secular liberalism is. Secularism is a doctrine about the polity, about forms of political governance. And a secular liberalism is a particular form of secularism which only asks, indeed demands, that basic liberal laws or principles such as freedom of speech or gender justice, racial justice, and so on, cannot be put aside for the sake of a religion. So if religion in any way enters public life, it cannot enter public life in a way that puts aside or supersedes these basic liberal commitments. And I've just given you some of the most basic as examples. So think of it this way. There's a lexical ordering. The liberal principles and laws, such as the ones I mentioned, are basic. They trump other commitments we have. So if you have religious commitments which clash with these, then the demand is that the liberal principles and laws always win. Okay? So suppose you're committed to free speech. It's one of the most fundamental commitments of liberalism. Then if your religious commitments tell you that you must punish blasphemy or censor blasphemy even, then that has to be put aside if you're a secular liberal. Okay? So if you take the case of Islam, I'm from a Muslim background, so I'll speak mostly about Islam in the little time I have. So Muslims have certain attitudes in their personal laws and so on towards about alimony, divorce, and so on, which discriminate against women. And so if you're in a secular liberal country, those laws must be put aside. Similarly with Muslim commitments to how to treat non-Muslims, etc. If those go against basic liberal ideals of equal rights and so on, those religious commitments must be put aside. So that's the basic structure of secular liberalism, that there is a lexical ordering, the liberal principles and laws come first. You are allowed to have any religious commitments you like, so long as they don't transgress the basic liberal commitments. Okay? That's all I mean by secular liberalism, and that's my basic political commitment. I mean, I have other commitments which don't particularly have to do with secularism, which and I'm very critical of liberalism for failing in those other respects. I have more or less basic commitments to a roughly socialist political economy, and liberalism has always, for one reason or another in its intellectual history, found itself pitting liberty against economic equality, and that has been a great weakness of liberalism, but it's got nothing to do with the issues of secularism. Okay, so that's what I mean by secularism, and perfectly devout people can be secular in the sense that I mean. Let me talk a little bit now about Islam in particular. I know Vinoth will talk about Christianity, but I can talk more informatively about Islam since I come from a Muslim background. You know, it's an interesting thing that even somebody like George Bush said after September 11th that most Muslims are not extremists or fundamentalists. It's one of the, perhaps the only worthy thing he said in that period. And so then, I think that's true. And I think that's true even in Tehran or Peshawar. So there's a really good question here which arises, which is, if it is the case that most Muslims are not extremists or fundamentalists, fundamentalist is a bad word, I prefer the word absolutist for reasons I won't go into here. If that is so, how is it that the extremist gets the most public attention? There's something going wrong with democracy if it is the case. If democracy is supposed to calibrate public importance with numbers, and the numbers are such that fundamentalists or absolutists are a small minority of a certain population, why is it that they get to be a much more unrepresentative voice in the community? That's a question really worth trying to diagnose and answer. What makes it the case that a fractional minority gets to become a representative voice in the media, in generally in people's social understanding of religious population? And I think it's a very interesting fact that even in a country like Pakistan, parties which stand for fundamentalist politics, etc., never get anywhere. They've never gotten more than 12% of the vote, except in one region after the invasion of Afghanistan, where there was. But by and large, my conviction is, and it's based on empirical facts, that unless there is a place in which Islam has been suppressed, as in Algeria or Egypt, you will not find people voting for Islamist groups. So in the Palestinian territories, for instance, people didn't vote for Hamas in the last election, which was a very narrow win for them, and partly because the Fatah party ran two candidates against each other and so on. So, but even if you look at that, where Hamas did win, and Hamas is a fundamentalist religion-based party, the success of Hamas is not because people in the Palestinian people are religious fundamentalists, but because Fatah the Palestinian Authority was a corrupt body, and because Hamas was pretty much the only group which was providing basic services to a very brutalized people, medical services and basically keeping civil society alive. So those are the reasons why sometimes religious parties do win, or if they're suppressed, and then of course there is a backlash against the suppression. Okay, so one of the questions that I'd like us to think about is, what is it about the public realm that the extremists always get the most attention. They get the most attention because states pay attention to people who make the loudest noise and the shrillest voices, even if they are an unrepresentative minority. If they are organized and they make a loud noise for status reasons, just keeping the peace and so on, states pay attention to them, so does the media, and so on. So that explains some of the fact that we think there's much more extremism and fundamentalism than there is. But then you have to ask a question, especially about the Muslim world. It's a question worth asking about the heartland of this country too. And that is, and this is, I think, a very crucial and important question for all of us to try and figure out. Why is it that if most Muslims do not agree with the extremists or fundamentalists, in fact, they often despise them for bringing disruption into their lives? Why is it that they don't come out and openly criticize them? I think that's something really worth trying to understand historically. And I don't think you can understand it historically unless you understand the history of colonialism in the Middle East and in South Asia, where there have been large Muslim populations, where there's a great defensive psychology amongst Muslims. And the feeling is that if you criticize the fundamentalists, you are somehow letting the side down against an external enemy which has been there for hundreds of years of colonial rule. And in the urban areas of European cities, you feel the same refusal of ordinary Muslims to criticize the extremists amongst their myths, because they feel subjugated by the racism of Western European society. So that explains a lot of the refusal of ordinary secular Muslims to come out and be critical of the anti-secular extremist and fundamentalist forces. And there's no way to get people out of a defensive psychology unless you stop the causes and the sources of the defensiveness, right? Which is, but if you bomb the hell out of their countries, and if you constantly vilify them in your media and so on, you are not going to get rid of this defensive psychology. So the two internal tensions in religious populations, which you have to try and understand. One is the clash between extremists and absolutists. But two, the clash within the minds of the ordinary secular Muslims. By secular Muslims, I don't mean people who are not believers, but who don't want to be run, their lives to be run by the Sharia, or who don't want to drive aeroplanes into buildings and so on. And that's all I mean by secularism, people who don't particularly want to be ruled by a religious set of laws. Their defensive psychology, I'm saying, will never, ever subside unless there is the root causes of these things are addressed. And I think Western nations, particularly the United States, has been very, very insensitive to that particular issue. So let me just close then. Do I have about 5 minutes? Have I gone on too long? Yeah. I should wind up. Okay, so let me then close by raising one last point on this question. You see, there's something odd that is shared by people like Hitchens and so on, who've been criticizing religion, and the extremists. And I think the kind of secularism that Hitchens wants is in some bizarre and perverse way shares one notion with the extremists, say Muslim extremists, but also Christians and all, whom Dawkins and Hitchens have attacked. And that is this. I'm claiming that it's perfectly possible to be a devout person and be a secularist in the sense that I outlined. Now, Christopher Hitchens once told me in a talk here when I raised some questions for him, he said it's impossible, he says the concept of a moderate Muslim is an inconsistent one, a self-contradictory one. If you believe in Islam, you cannot remain moderate. Now, that view, I think, is wrong for the following simple reason. It has a view of identity, of religious commitment and identity, which in some of my writings I've called a codified view of identity. That is, you have a checklist, and you're not a Muslim unless everything on the checklist is checked off, right? So if you haven't checked off censorship of blasphemy, you're not a Muslim, right? You have to check off everything, and so there's no malleability about Muslim identity or religious identity. There's a checklist, and everything must be checked off. It's a codified conception of what it is to be a Muslim or a Christian, etc. And that notion of identity is egregiously wrong. Identity is a very fluid and malleable notion, and you can be a secular Muslim in just the sense that you remain a Muslim and you don't cease being a Muslim just because you give up on some family law about alimony or divorce, or you stop wearing the parda, or you allow blasphemy to be freely spoken and written about. So it's the wrong conception of what it is to be religious, which gives you the wrong conception of what it is to be secular. And bizarrely, Christopher Hitchens and company and the extremists have the same notion of identity. The Muslim extremist or the Christian extremist says, you're not a Muslim unless everything is checked off. That's exactly how Hitchens thinks of it. They take the opposite views on which is right, but they share an assumption. And that's the assumption that I think you should question if you believe in secularism of the form that I'm committed to. Thanks very much.
Thank you again to the Veritas Forum for inviting me to be part of this discussion. And thank you, Dr. Bilgrami, for your presentation. I think we're going to agree more than we disagree this evening. But we were invited by the moderator just beforehand to sort of make this dialogue more invigorating by raising perhaps other issues which may be more controversial than what Dr. Bilgrami has shared and with which I'm in agreement mostly. So let me just begin by saying that the word secular actually belongs to Christian theology. Historically, the saeculum in Latin meant the world as created by God, as loved by God, fundamentally good, although twisted and spoilt by evil. The world had a certain autonomy from God, so God does not have a suffocating relationship with the world, but actually works within the world. And so that temporal order, the saeculum, is actually hallowed by God and the arena of God's activity in classical Christian theology. And so the contrast with the secular is not the religious or the sacred or the spiritual, but rather the eternal. If the secular is a temporal order, although it is good, it's hallowed by God, it cannot bring about God's ultimate reign, which comes from beyond the secular, which intersects with the secular and transforms the secular to become all that God intended it to be. And that is why the word religion as such rarely occurs in the Bible. And not only in the Bible and the Christian tradition, there are hardly any Indian languages, or I think even Chinese, where the word religion occurs. Religion is largely a 17th century European construct. And the distinction between the secular and the religious, therefore, is part of the whole history of Western modernity. The 17th century was a very interesting period because many words like mysticism and supernatural acquired new meanings. Take, for example, supernatural. Traditionally, the word supernatural meant something that acts contrary to its nature. So supposing you found a chimpanzee composing sonnets, that chimpanzee was acting supernaturally. But that meant that the very last person you could apply that concept to was God, if, for example, you meant that God, in being generous and gracious in his dealings with his creatures, was acting supernaturally. No, that is the very nature of God. And somewhere in the 17th century, the word supernatural ceased to be an adjective and became a noun, a substantive noun. And it denoted a particular territory, an extraterrestrial territory that was inhabited by ghosts and demons and angels and poltergeists. And in that extraterrestrial realm, God also found his existence. And so the word supernatural now comes to mean something that is outside of nature, and the whole question of whether we believe in God, which for people like Augustine and Aquinas meant setting your heart's desire on that holy mystery disclosed in Jesus Christ, what Augustine called the fullness of life, that ceased to, and walking in adventure, walking on pilgrimage with that God, now became instead the question of whether you believe there is some entity that inhabits that supernatural realm. And so the meanings of secular and the meaning of religious change from period to period and place to place. And every definition of the secular carries with it a concomitant redefinition of religion. And that is why it's such a difficult subject to speak about, because you want to know, how do people actually use this word, religious or secular, and what do they mean by it? Deep in every human heart, there is a propensity for worship. And if men and women do not worship their creator, they end up worshiping created objects, whether an artifact like a technology, it can be an idea, it can be an institution, or even an individual. Just as nature abhors a vacuum, the empty shrine does not remain empty for long. So those who insist that the public square be untouched by any moral or spiritual or transcendent vision are those who have themselves seized the commanding heights of the public square and will not tolerate anything that stands in the way of their political dominion or hegemony. So the pluralism of goods that, say, secular liberal societies claim to protect often exists only at the private level. In the public square, the liberal state defends and imposes a particular set of goods, such as a free market economy, unlimited technological progress, national sovereignty. And it's on behalf of these that many wars have been fought with other states. We need to remember that we live in the wake of the most monstrously violent century in human history, the 20th century, during which largely secular states of both the political left and the political right were willing to kill on an unprecedented scale and with an ease of conscience worse than merely depraved. So if ever an age deserved to be called the age of darkness, surely it is ours. So hundreds of millions of people have been slaughtered, imprisoned, and impoverished all over the world in the name not of some traditional religious deities, but modern, if you like, secular faiths, nationalism, fascism, democratic capitalism, revolutionary Marxism, and state socialism. As Dr. Bilgrami pointed out, Iraq's Ba'athist regime and many of the repressive regimes in the Muslim world, from Algeria to Indonesia until recently, have been aggressively secularist regimes and not traditionally religious ones. Now, those of you who know your American history, you know Alexis de Tocqueville, the French aristocrat who came here in 1836 to investigate the state of prisons in America, but his interest was deflected by what he saw of the democratic experiment in America. And he wrestled with that question: how is it that the French Revolution, which was a popular mass revolution in the name of liberty and equality, failed in France, but the American Revolution, which was relatively violence-free, succeeded? And he found that actually, although religion did not take any direct part in American government, he called it their fundamental, their first public institution. It was freedom of worship, he said, that undergirded all other liberties. And in those New England townships, freedom of worship combined with a fairly rough social and economic equality was the seedbed in which American democracy flourished. And so when the War of Independence broke out, it was that love for liberty that then went beyond those local townships in New England, Rhode Island, and so on, and actually took over the state. And so this idea that somehow religious liberty, freedom of worship, is opposed to the idea of democracy, republicanism, secularism, is actually an alien concept in terms of your own history. Even the way that the so-called wars of religion of Europe are described by many secularist historians is very misleading. Because as William Cavanaugh points out in his recent book, The Myths of Religious Violence, he says, although most secular liberal historians speak of the wars of religion as what necessitated the birth of the modern nation-state or liberal state, those wars were really the birth pangs of the nation-state. They were struggles for dominance amongst rival political dynasties, kings and nobles, who were often willing to change their church allegiance if they served their secular interests. So what is at issue, he writes, behind these wars is the creation of religion as a set of private beliefs, which now can be held separately from one's loyalty to the state. So the state now claims to own our bodies, and what we do in our personal private lives is therefore irrelevant. So the creation of religion and the privatization of the church is correlative to the rise of the modern state. So it's important to see that the principal promoters of those wars in 17th century France and Germany were not pastors and peasants, but kings and nobles who had a stake in the outcome of the movement towards a centralized hegemonic state. The British sociologist Zygmunt Bauman observes with dry humor, and I quote, "In most of its descriptions, modernity is presented as a time of secularization and disenchantment. What is less often mentioned, however, though it should be, is that modernity also deified and enchanted the nation, the new authority, and so by proxy, the man-made institutions that claim to speak and act in its name. The sacred was not so much disavowed as made the target of an unfriendly takeover, moved under different management, and put in the service of the emergent nation-state. The same happened to the martyr. He was enlisted by the nation-state under a new name of the hero." So blasphemy, for example, ceases to be an offense, but it is replaced by treason. So whether state-sponsored violence is inspired by belief in a God or by a belief that all talk of God has to be eliminated by whatever means, the common denominator here is not divinity, but humanity. And that is what makes talk of having faith in humanity so ludicrous. Now, Christians have always acknowledged that what is called religious and is an impulse that is common to all societies, and it is ambivalent. On the one hand, it expresses a natural desire for God, and yet on the other hand, it is also the manifestation of much violence, superstition, and degrading, amoral behavior. On many occasions, it becomes the occasion for delusions, cruelties, and tyrannies. But why should we be surprised? Consider the following analogy. Take the universality of sexual experience. Here is a powerful human drive, but it is also the site of rape, pedophilia, bestiality, genital mutilation, and other grotesque acts. Now, most of us would regard these acts as twisted perversions of a healthy and important component of our human identity and flourishing. So why not apply the same reasoning to what are called religious faiths or traditions? Given the universality of religious experience, it's hardly surprising that certain acts of grotesque violence should not only occur in religious communities, but also be imbued with religious meanings and justification. Now, religious differences by themselves do not entail conflict and violence. It's only when religious differences are used in a political context to justify depriving others of civil liberties, of equal educational opportunities, or access to economic resources, then only does difference become violent. And this is normally the case when a particular religious tradition or community is identified with a particular territorial space. So that political space is then treated as a sacred space whose custodianship lies with that particular religious community. And then other religious communities are treated as socially inferior, and they are politically marginalized. Now let me move track somewhat and share, because I've been asked to, also from my own personal experience. Why am I a Christian? Why did I choose to become a Christian? Well, there's something so absurd, so foolish about the Christian message, the heart of the Christian message, that it just gets under my skin. Because imagine you're in the first century Roman world, and there is a cause that you have come to believe in, and you want to woo other people. You want to persuade the educated social elites of the Roman world to join your cause. Well, the last thing you would ever do is to link your cause with a recently crucified man. Because crucifixion was not only a horrible form of death, it was the most humiliating form of death. No Roman citizen could be crucified. It was a form of public execution, like a death penalty, that was reserved for rebellious slaves, the dregs of society, what today would be called terrorists. Now imagine a group of people just moving around the Mediterranean world, the Roman Empire, announcing that amongst those insignificant nobodies, those terrorists, those political criminals, there was one who was no less than the Son of God himself, and that Caesar would one day bow to this crucified Jew. That's an incredible message. It's utter madness. It's foolishness. It's not something that could have been invented, and for me it carries a ring of truth. Because what was it that convinced those early disciples of Jesus that he was not another messianic pretender? He was more than just a rabbi or a prophet. Was his physical resurrection. And that was the heart, the core conviction of the Christian faith. So I would disagree with Dr. Bilgrami that doctrine is not important, because the Christian faith did not present itself to the world as a superior moral system, a better way of life, but fundamentally a new conviction about God and about human beings, that God had taken into his own divine life our damaged humanity in order to heal it and to reconcile it, to bring about a new human creation. And the resurrection of Jesus was a foretaste, a pledge. The language that is used in the New Testament is a language drawn from agriculture, the first fruits, the beginning of the harvest of a new human race that we catch a glimpse of this new human race as we look at this crucified and risen Jewish peasant. Now, that's an incredible message. And this vision, far from breeding any sense of religious superiority or moral superiority, actually impelled those who believed in it to actually care for the dregs of humanity, the dispossessed, the diseased, the degraded. And that has been the story of Christian mission around the world, even to this day. And that is why Christian missionaries, the best of them anyway, have sought to translate this message into local vernaculars, many languages, vernaculars that were on the point of extinction were thus resurrected. Many forgotten tribes and people groups suddenly became subjects of history as a result of the Bible being translated into their tongues, and that often involved writing down their vernaculars for the very first time. So cultural diversity was actually endorsed and promoted in the Christian mission. Now, we know from the historical record that Christians are every bit as culpable as any other kind of fanatic in reducing other people to instruments in the service of their cause. They've often proved incapable of distinguishing what is genuinely Christian, Christ-like, from what is nationalist or cultural chauvinism. The church, which is a community called to be a sign of God's intention to heal the nations, has often been a fallible, flawed institution in every age, struggling to free itself from the very idolatries that it exposes in the world. Now, all the major world faiths make universal truth claims, and these cannot be confined to a private, so-called religious realm without serious distortion. So any secularist demand that social harmony requires the surrender of such truth claims or their demotion to the status of mere opinion has to be rejected. That is not to show respect for people and their traditions. Public indifference towards truth is no less harmful to a civilization than fanatical insistence on the truth. In his great novel, The Fall, Albert Camus' world-weary narrator, Jean-Baptiste Clemens, says of modern European man, he fornicated and read the newspapers. Today we would probably change that to fornicating and surfing the internet. The boredom that attends postmodern consumerism is the other side of a culture which has lost all awareness of its religious heritage and is fixated on novelty for its own sake. So we have to distinguish between a political or a constitutional secularism and a secularist culture. A constitution or political secularism is one that invites all people of all communities to make their unique contributions to national life in the language and the idiom that is uniquely theirs. No one group can dictate to others, and it is out of such a genuine public dialogue that a multiculturally constituted public space can emerge, along with our specific religious and cultural particularities. So such a public culture can never be imposed by the state from the top down or by the dominant community. It can only come from below. But one of the important functions of the state at both national and local levels is to foster the social conditions that make such dialogue, such conversations and negotiations possible. Now, some of these conditions are legislative, for example, providing equal protection for all under the law, irrespective of their beliefs and behavior. But most will have to do with the way that civil society institutions are run. For example, a fair and responsible media, to which members of all religious communities have access. Schools and universities, which are non-sectarian, and where all communities can freely interact. All cultural groups in a pluralistic society, whether they be considered religious or secular, have to challenge their members to be self-critical, to develop what Hannah Arendt called enlarged mentalities, so that while not necessarily surrendering their core convictions and values, they must still be held to practice an empathetic appreciation of other viewpoints. Now, whether a group can nurture such a sensibility in their members would be a test of what they contribute to public well-being. In closing, last year, a famous philosopher by the name of Leszek Kolakowski, a profound religious philosopher, died. And in a tribute to Kolakowski, John Gray, who is the professor of the history of European thought at the London School of Economics, said this in his tribute. He says, "Religion has had a formative influence on our categories of thought, which it is the task of philosophy to examine. Excavating the archaeology of our concepts is a part of philosophical inquiry. And for us, that inescapably involves tracing their debts to Judaism and Christianity. Any way of doing philosophy that neglects these traditions is unhistorical and impoverished." Gray also reminds us that many so-called secular projects, from human rights to modern experimental science, have deeply religious roots. Secular societies are societies ruled by repressed religion. And what is called secular humanism is actually a Christian heresy in the sense of being a one-sided development of an important Christian truth, the unique dignity and value of human beings. So secular humanism is not an independent successor to Christianity, but a hollowed-out version of it. Or to change the metaphor, it's a parasite. It's parasitic on the very worldview that it tries to marginalize. Thank you. Yes, I've already mentioned it, but I'd like to take up this thing you mentioned about religious traditions, communities, whatever we call them, not being defined by beliefs, or what you say, doctrines. I agree that it's much more than beliefs, but our ways of life are also shaped fundamentally by what we believe. There are worldviews that are embodied in the different religious traditions. So could you just explain a little more about what you meant?
Yeah, Vinoth. Here's what I meant. I feel that when you get all these polls which say, 70 or 80% of Americans believe in creationism and so on, it may be true. People just say yes to questions. Do you believe in it? People have said yes to me when I've asked them, and then, within 20 minutes of serious and earnest talk, which we probed each other's views, they said it was not to be taken literally, that it was a metaphor, or that's in my experience. I mean, I don't doubt that there are people who actually wouldn't say that, but what seems to me the much more deep and important thing about religion is something you yourself were also saying, that about what was the greatness of Christianity and so on, is that it has meant things in the lives of people that is not just in their belief systems, but what it does to improve people's lives in much broader ways, including their practices. So, for instance, I believe that historically it is probably perfectly right to say, as historians have said, that it was Christianity which undermined slavery in that part of the world. That's a remarkable achievement for religion, but it came from a belief. If you believe everybody in the house of God is the same, then it does make a difference. But the greatness of it was what it did in the lives of people, right? And so the irritation I feel with these up-to-the-minute atheists, these bullies, basically, bully boys, twerps like Hitchens and so on, is that they don't see what is deep and important. Say about the American heartland, what religion means in the lives of people, and how, if you just make a comparison with why there isn't religion to the same anything like the same degree in Western Europe. It's got very little to do with doctrine, but what it has meant in the lives of people. So that's
yes.
a response to.
Yes, I have some sympathy for these militant, hardcore atheists. I was just telling my wife last week that if I grew up in America and all I saw of Christianity was what was on religious television in this country, and the popular books that are there in the bookstores, I would be so repulsed. But fortunately, I have access to the more serious Christian literature, and I meet people who are humbly living out their Christian faith in all walks of life. But there would be many people here, perhaps even in Columbia University, who don't have access to such people, and you would say perhaps even access to people who are genuinely living out Islamic faith.
Yeah.
And so there is this, I don't know, a sort of a lowest common denominator that is, I think you touched on this earlier when you referred to the media, that it's often the crass, it's the
right.
ugly aspects of religious communities
right.
that is in the public light, and
right.
which has a lot of financial funding and backing.
But you see, the thing is that I feel that my colleagues and people liberals, metropolitan liberals, who despise the citizens. After the 2004 election, when Bush won, I would sit around talking to liberal colleagues, and they talked. One of them actually described. In fact, I think I read it somewhere in some op-ed that the population in the heartland which voted for Bush was vile and stupid. Right? Now, I think that is not compatible with democracy. You cannot believe that half the population of the country is vile and stupid, that half the electorate of the country is vile and stupid, and believe in democracy. Right? So you have got to diagnose what it is. So I don't find it repugnant that these people believe what they believe, or that they wanted to fight wars in Afghanistan in the name of religion. You don't despise them for that. You can disagree with that, but you've got to analyze how come they came to have those beliefs. And I think religion plays two completely different roles in their lives because their minds are in two different frames. One frame, religion plays a role in their lives which is very humane and compassionate. When they're faced with individual problems and so on, as individuals, they respond with humanity and compassion, and often that's dictated by their religious beliefs and convictions. But then their minds are shaped by the media, what they've learned from these, and from their homes and their educations and so on. And so the same person, who says, should the poor in Harlem be better off? They say, of course they should be better off. But then you put the question to them in slight economic jargon or something like that and say, should there be more taxes so that one can help pay for their welfare? He says, no, you must never have taxes. So they're in two different frames. You see, the minds are, one is, religion is functioning in one way, but then when their minds are shaped by education and so on, they answer completely inconsistently with it, and because they haven't brought the frames together.
Yes.
And I believe it's the task of politics to remove the borders between the frames so that they can decide which is the right view. And politics never does that.
Well, not just a task of politics, it's a task of the teachers within their respective communities to help them integrate what they believe with their way of life. And I think that's where the idea of worldviews or doctrines or beliefs does come in.
That's true, but I myself don't have much faith in education. That is to say, I believe on every important matter, on every great change in this country has come at the site of popular movements. It has not been at the, I mean, universities have joined in late, but the great labor legislation that took place in this country happened as a result of popular movements. The great civil rights changes and women's rights changes that happened in this country happened as a result of popular movements. Universities, teachers were slow to catch on.
Yes.
It came much later. So I do believe that the great changes come when there are movements on the streets. I think FDR understood this, and in fact FDR is famous for having said, when I.F. Stone describes that people went to him and asked him for some, with some demands, and he said, I agree with your demands, now go out on the street and make me do it. Right? So I think that the real changes happen not at the sites of, I mean, political leaders are not creative once they're close to power. And I think universities are much too close to power. I mean, there are a few professors who will say heterodox things and so on, but by and large, I don't have much faith in universities. So if you mean by teachers, teachers who actually mobilize people at the grassroots and popular movements and so on.
No, I didn't mean university teachers. I myself had decided not to follow an academic pursuit, but I meant local religious communities, whatever, churches or mosques, where, you know, where people are actually taught to bring their life, their politics, and their beliefs into some kind of harmony, some kind of consistency. I was in the Columbia University bookstore just before this Veritas began, and again, Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, and Dan Brown's books, all prominently displayed. This is a university, one of the most prestigious universities in the world. Where do you find a serious book on Islam or Christian theology or related to social?
Not in Barnes and Noble.
You don't find it in the Columbia University bookstore. So,
Akeel, do you have a question?
Yeah, there are a couple of things, you know, that I'd like to explore with you. You know, I think that you said some very interesting things about disenchantment and so on, which I'm also very interested in. See, I think the word supernatural, you're absolutely right to study its progeny in the 17th century and so on, but I think it has three meanings. There's one meaning which is sacral, and natural is the non-sacral or the non-religious. The second is transcendent and immanent, and actually those two don't coincide because pantheism is immanent and it's sacral, right? So you need two different ideas of supernatural, which is A, sacral, but B, transcendent. And by the second criterion, pantheism is not supernatural, right? It's immanent. But the third meaning, which I think is a really interesting modern meaning, is that natural, and this is how natural, what natural is defined by philosophers, and that is that natural is what the natural sciences study. Nature is what the natural sciences study, and supernature is what falls outside of the coverage of natural science. That's the current way of thinking about what is natural and supernaturalism. And I find that very interesting because I think that there are, I'm an atheist, I'm sorry to say, so we disagreed on this very fundamental thing. But my view is that there is lots in nature that the natural science can't study, and that is value. That nature, I believe nature and the world around us is shot through with values. And values don't just come from us. We don't make them up. We respond to the evaluative and normative demands of the world, including nature, including forests and trees. And therefore, natural sciences do not have full coverage of nature. And I can say this even though I'm an atheist. And what happens is that though I agree with you that humanism and secularism of the kind that I espouse is parasitic on religion, that parasitism is historical and genealogical. That is, it began because nature and the world was shot through with value, but value in a certain time had a sacred source. And I think what I say, that when I say that nature is shot through with value, that's a secular form of enchantment. And I think it's genealogically parasitic on the sacral conceptions of value, but it emerged from that. But I think, since I I'm an atheist in the sense that I think that science's questions like the origins of life and the origins of the universe and all should be answered by science, and they're not answered by appealing to God and his acts and so on. So I believe in secular forms of enchantment which have their historical and genealogical source in sacral notions, but I think now, conceptually speaking, are independent of them.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, the scientific enterprise itself raises questions about how is science possible and why does science work? And I think that those are questions that I would say take us beyond science, because science is based on at least three fundamental assumptions. One is that the world is intelligible, that there are patterns or structures to it. Secondly, that these are contingent structures. You don't sit in your armchair and reason how the world is, but you go and you explore, you make experiments, and you adopt a humble posture, and you're willing to be corrected by what you discover. And thirdly, that the human mind is capable of discovering the underlying structure and intelligibility of the world. And that's an enormous assumption to make, given the fact that we human beings have only appeared on the planet Earth, 15 billion years after the origin of the universe, and we are a tiny microscopic speck of dust on a rather obscure planet in the entire universe. So what is it that makes us really believe, it's sort of have this epistemic confidence that we can, despite our physical insignificance, unlock the patterns of the universe? Now, those assumptions make sense within a theistic worldview. That if our rationality and the rationality of the universe are both grounded in the prior rationality and faithfulness of a creator, then it makes sense to do science. And I think that's why historically modern science, experimental science, came out of Islamic and Jewish Christian cultures, because they had this theistic undergirding. Today people do science because it's enormously successful. But if you philosophically, reflect on the foundations, I think you have to go beyond science and invoke some kind of personal transcendence.
I guess I really don't agree with that. My view is that, of course, one should humble oneself to the facts as they are, and there is. We are certainly a very. The story of humanity is a story of a very small part of the universe. But I guess I really don't see why our humility and our smallness gives us any confidence to believe in something which we don't have evidence for. Now, we do believe in a lot of things which we don't have evidence for, but I think we should step back and criticize it. I'm pretty sure Dawkins has superstitions. I bet you Dawkins avoids the cracks on the pavement. But the fact is that I don't see that our superstitions, we can have all sorts of foibles, we can acknowledge how humble we ought to be. Scientists are constantly acknowledging how humble they are and how much they don't know and probably will never know, and so on. Dawkins is saying things like that all the time, and he's an atheist. So I'm not convinced that the ultimate things are in some sense sui generis. That is to say, values I don't know where values come from. I don't believe you can get values out of a normative void. I think values are basic. They're primitive things, just as I think that thoughts are primitive things. You can't step down and behind them and say, well, I'm going to explain values by natural science or anything like that. So I'm not in the slightest bit claiming anything great for natural science. All I'm saying is that there are questions in natural science which only natural science can answer. Questions about value are not questions in natural science. Right?
Yes, I agree.
And so if religion, and so if that means I'm religious, that I'm happy to call myself religious. But I think when you have questions about natural science, the ones that natural science raises about the origins of life and the origins of the universe, then you should answer those questions within the
Well, there are two kinds of questions of origins. I mean, there is the chronological question, what was the first event that, if you like, led to all the other events, which is, I agree with you, it's a scientific question, and the Bible and the Quran and religious traditions can't answer that. But then there is the ontological question of origins. Why is there a universe at all and not nothingness? And where do these values of truth and justice and love and so on, which we cherish, come from? Because nature doesn't give us these values. And either you have to say that these are human creations, we have chosen to create these values for purely instrumental purposes, or you to say, no, we are responding to values that are greater than us,
Yes.
and that perhaps, if you infer to the best explanation, then there is a personal God who sustains these values, who defines these values because they reflect God's very nature or character.
But I don't believe that there's an inference to the best explanation there. I mean, how come we have values is if you believe that question needs an explanation, then you're falling into the demands of what natural science keeps asking for. What I'm saying is you'll never get an explanation of that. You shouldn't be asking that question. If you believe that there is nothing in the world and in nature that natural science does not countenance, then of course you have to ask, well, what explains values? But I don't think anything can explain values, any more than I think than it can explain the fact that each of us have spiritual urges. You can give an evolutionary account of any of this. You can give an evolutionary account of the fact that we perceive values, whereas if a snail looks in the same place where we look, it cannot perceive values. So it certainly depends on the kinds of sensibilities we have, and that is a product of evolution and so on. But evolution merely enables us to see things. But an enabling explanation is not a reductive scientific explanation. It just tells you, it's not what these philosophers want. It just tells you, if you and I didn't have a large enough brain, we couldn't be responsive to values as we are. Right? So evolution just tells you what enables us to do things, but it doesn't give you the answer to the largest questions. But I'm saying to demand that there must be answers to the largest questions is to fall into a trap, which science does in its narrow way. I think we have to say that some things are sui generis. But do we have time? No.
We should move on to the questions so we can just get the audience.
Audience, yes, right.
A lot of the questions have to do with American politics and the place of Christianity, the Christian right, religion, faith, etc. Just for opening this up, what do you think of the place of the Christian right within the American political system? Is it too much? Is it too little? Should there be more Christianity?
Well, I'm a foreigner. I don't live here, but I'm embarrassed. I must confess, the Christian right has always embarrassed me. I feel it's a contradiction in terms.
Now, why do you say that?
Huh?
Why do you say that?
Well, I think because historically, you mentioned the social democratic movements in Europe, and I think there was a much Christian influence on those. The Labour Party in Britain, the founders of the Labour Party were all committed Methodists, Keir Hardie and so on, because they recognized that the implications of the Christian gospel was that God identifies with the poor, the weak, the vulnerable. That is the core message of the cross of Jesus, that God himself becomes a victim of history. And that gives us a sensibility, a sensitivity to other victims. Now, the Christian right lacks that. And I think there is a fundamental denial of the gospel there. I think it's inconsistent to defend the rights of embryonic and fetal human beings and be indifferent to the conditions in inner city ghettos, which, or the children who are dying in Iraq and Afghanistan. To be consistent, one has to defend the rights of human beings from conception to death, irrespective of whether they're Americans or Iraqis or Afghans. And so there are these fundamental inconsistencies in the position of the Christian right. But I know that there are many Christians who don't belong to the Christian right, but sadly their voices are not highlighted in the media, and you probably know that better than I, why that is the case. Professor Bilgrami mentioned it. So the Christian right gets a lot of media attention because the media loves the extremist positions. So they would rather go to, say, Jerry Falwell for his opinion on some issue than to talk with a more responsible, more educated, if you like, Christian spokesman who can give a much more Christian and more sensible response to a policy issue. But that's the media. So I think we are imprisoned a lot by the way the media present the Christian church in this country.
Yeah, I agree with the thing is that we've got to, as I said, you can't despise half the country. That is just undemocratic. You can't believe in democracy and despise half the country. That's just not compatible with the belief in democracy. The people like Churchill, who is an Indian I cannot admire, who said stupid things like, all forms of government are terrible. No, democracy is a terrible form of government, but it's better than other forms of government, and that's why we should adopt it. But I don't understand that. If you believe that people are stupid and vile, I don't know why. If I believe that Vinoth was a wonderful man and that ordinary people are stupid and vile, I'd believe in enlightened monarchy and make him the king. I mean, I don't understand how you could possibly believe in democracy and believe that. So what I think you have to do is to try and diagnose why it is that half the people in the country have had warmongering attitudes, say in 2001 or 2002, and invoked Christianity and so on behalf of those attitudes, etc. You've got to try and understand why that is, and I think one good way to do it is to talk about the differences with Western Europe and try and understand even further why social democratic traditions, labor movements of a serious kind, which offer solidarities to people and community to people, didn't arise here. This is a country of immigrants, and when you have a predominantly recently arrived immigrant groups, they want to assimilate. They don't want to make troubles. They don't want to start movements. There are all sorts of social reasons you've got to get behind to understand the heartland of this country. If Dawkins was prepared to do that, right, to use his great intelligence, nobody can deny he's one of the most intelligent people there is, but if he was prepared to try and do that, I would take him seriously. But right now, I think he's a silly man who's wasting his intelligence because he doesn't understand what the depths of religious issues are in this country, or indeed in anywhere in the world.
Well, what place do you think religion or Christianity should play within American politics? Well,
I think I said that. I think that the people's beliefs shouldn't be. You shouldn't bully people from believing in interesting things. I think there are lots of interesting things. Matthew is one of the noblest books I've ever read, for the kinds of reasons that Vinoth talked about poverty, and in fact, in the goodness of the judgment of ordinary people. The Bible is full of things like that. These are noble words by any standards.
Well, I'll give you an example. Majority of Americans are against gay marriage, and they say that it is based on religious faith. Should we deny rights of people because the majority feels it is their faith that should kind of dictate their political position on that?
No, of course not. I mean, we should fight for what we believe. So, but the fact is, you've got to understand why people do. As I said, look, I know somebody. I'm very close to my wife's parents, in fact, who may have all sorts of conservative views, but I know that they will take in somebody into the house and have taken somebody into the house who's gay. Because the person was a friend of their daughters and fell under very hard times. So, as I said, even people with very conservative religious views on subjects like the ones you mentioned, will, when faced with individual situations, when the individual religious values come in, will respond invariably humanely and compassionately. But you put the same question to them when their minds have been surrendered to the media, to all these talk shows, to their schools and so on, and put the same questions really on the same subject in the jargon that their minds have been distorted by, they'll give completely inconsistent answers. So I think what you've got to do is to figure out, and I believe it's the task of public life. I mean, Vinoth was right to correct me that I shouldn't just say politics. It's the task of public life, which can include educators in the broad sense, to get people to see, to get people to come to be critical of their minds that have been trained by the media and so on and so forth, by the lights of their own humanity and compassion, which emerges in a different frame, in a different context. You know, psychologists call this a frame problem. The frame problem is you give inconsistent views, but you don't know you're giving them inconsistent views because they're in different frames.
Mm-hmm. I said in my presentation that, I mean, a truly impartial state doesn't seek to silence religious voices, but to encourage people to speak and express their opinions. But obviously, you're more likely to persuade others if you can avoid using religious language and present more general arguments for your position, and even use some of the assumptions and shared opinions that others have to sort of convince them why your position is better than theirs. But in a democracy, this is all done through dialogue, debate, and argument. It is not one group trying to manipulate or coerce the other. So I think where political groups, religious political groups, whether Christian, Muslim, or even secularist political groups that want to use coercion, and there are certain sections of the gay rights movement that want to use coercion rather than debate and argument. And
what do you mean, like what in particular did you have in mind?
Well, I'm not thinking of, I don't know the American situation, but certainly in other parts of the world. And I think all these groups are undermining genuine participatory democracy. And I think the media, the education system has a large role to play in getting people to meet together and talk face to face, listen and appreciate each other's arguments. And then finally, if you vote, because this is a democracy, you have to abide by the decision of the majority. You can disagree, but respect it. Yeah.
There are times with the Supreme Court and the federal judiciary, which is a very hot subject in dealing with the issue of faith, when the Supreme Court will come in and say, it doesn't matter what the majority says. We have this Constitution, and there are these people with these rights, the right of women and choice, for example. And even though a majority might be against choice, nonetheless, we are going to say that they have this right that is inviolate. Is that right?
Well, I don't know. I think it's a case-by-case basis. But I think there are times when judicial review can actually undermine democracy.
And that's a bad thing.
Yes, I think that Parliament, or in your case, Congress, is truly what represents democracy, and not the courts.
But
in terms of rights, you know, when rights rub up against faith and the majority, and this big discussion that both of you are talking about, what is the right thing to do there?
But the whole point of rights, see, you have to ask the question, what makes what makes rights different from other sorts of values, right? The right to free speech is a value, but we then elevate some values amongst all the values we have into rights, into fundamental or constitutional rights. But they are basically values, but we erect them into having a higher status. Now, what does that higher status amount to? What is it to say that it's not just an ordinary value, but a special elevated value, which we call rights? What is that? Well, the answer is that it's precisely the kind of thing that we will not have undermined if people just change their minds and a majority emerges against them, right? So they have, it's a little bit like Ulysses and the Sirens, right? You sort of tie yourself to the mast by elevating values into a right. You just say, these, even if we weaken and want to censor, you know, if neo-Nazis come into our vicinity, we might weaken in our commitment to free speech and want to censor them. But if it's a right, then we can't do it, right? So, of course, majorities shift all the time. But what makes a right is that you tie yourself to the mast in some way. And you don't allow yourself to weaken. And so if a majority just suddenly comes out of this kind of weakening, that's the concept of rights. Now, some people may not believe in rights, but though I agree, though I agree with that very often judicial review can be a very reactionary thing, in fact, and undemocratic thing and so on, but nevertheless, that doesn't affect the question of rights, which I believe do have this function.
But it begs the question of where those rights come from, or how do we determine what those rights are? Do we have the right to life, or do we have a right to choice? Which should it be? Supreme Court says choice. And so even a state like South Dakota, where the vast majority are anti-abortion, that state cannot pass an anti-abortion law.
Well,
is that right?
But historically, it's always been the case that it doesn't happen by a snap vote in Parliament or in Congress or whatever the legislative body is. It happened at an moment in the creation of a polity through a constituent assembly. That's the genealogy of how rights emerged. It happens through a very much more thorough discussion with lots of evidence brought in, but happens in a legislative group, but it's a very special kind of legislative group, which in the history of democracies has been constituent assemblies in the formation of, and then their amendments and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and there are reasons we give as to why in certain cases the right to choose does not involve the right to take life. And there are certain cases where the right to life is not absolute, like in war, for example. You're defending somebody whose life is in danger, an innocent life. So there is always a process of reasoning. You're not asserting a right, a clash of rights. Now, the problem, I think, in America today is that your moral vocabulary has so diminished that you can only use the language of right. So every moral demand is clothed in the language of an absolute right. And I think that's a reflection of your moral impoverishment, at least in public discourse.
Well, you know,
and I think there are other languages of also of obligations, responsibilities. Certainly, I believe in fundamental human rights. But when every moral demand is clothed in the language of a right, you cannot really then debate. You cannot argue. You must be able to give reasons. Where do these rights come from?
Well, I think that the notion of rights is ambiguous, and we should disambiguate it. There's one notion of rights, which is the strict liberal notion of rights, and that notion of rights is a notion which doesn't exist unless the state can implement it. So for instance, Salman Rushdie was protected with millions of dollars over years and years, because the right of free speech is a real right, a liberal right, and the state is absolutely committed to implementing it, right? But then we use the word right, as you quite rightly point out, to say people should have the right to work. Now, that is not, the reason why that's not a strict liberal right is because the state cannot implement it. In fact, if you have a capitalist society, we know that unemployment is built into the very nature of capitalism. You cannot have capitalism without a certain amount of unemployment. Those are the laws of capital. So given that, you couldn't possibly have a right to work in societies such as ours. So that use of the word rights is a completely second meaning to it. It is a mobilizational use. Yes. You know, when you use it, you're trying to mobilize people into making demands of various kinds. So you're quite right to notice that there are these two different uses, and we should keep them separate.
But, I mean, take the right to freedom of speech. I mean, that has also constraints. You have laws against libel and slander. Mm-hmm. There are many countries which have laws against hate speech. And I would support that, because every country has to develop a certain understanding of rights. Sure. which is also based on their historical experience. So
Sure.
it's natural that countries like Germany should have laws against hate speech, anti-Semitic hate speech, because of their particular history.
Yeah, but you see, you should treat those as built-in exceptions. So you have homicide,
Yes.
you have homicide laws, but you put them aside as in case of self-defense, etc. But those are built-in exceptions. They're not, as I said, giving in to the weakening and
Yes,
so on.
but
So
all I'm saying is those rights are not absolute. They're rights that, no right is absolute.
Yeah,
Some
but-
rights clash, but also rights are...
because you have exceptions, you
Yes.
built-in exceptions. Yeah, sure.
Yes. But my point is there is a process of reasoning that goes on in the formulation. It's not just an assertion and that's the end of the story.
Right. Sure.
Just in summation, I know that many of the students are very much grappling with the questions of secularism versus Christianity and faith. And I was wondering if either of you or both of you, through your own experiences, do you have any advice on kind of getting to the heart of this issue and these questions?
Well, in a very selfish way, I'll say read some of my books.
Book.
Which are on the book table.
You want to give a plug on it?
Yeah.
What's the title?
Well, I have a book that I wrote 10 years ago called Faiths in Conflict ?
Right.
Which began as a kind of critique of Samuel Huntington's thesis, but it developed into also talking about what secularism means and what it does not mean, and I argue for a pluralism of secularisms, that every state needs to develop versions of secularism, political secularism, that is appropriate to its own historical context, and there is no one blueprint, one model that can be, transported all over the world.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.